Welcome to our program on Asia's Pathways to Climate Resilience. This is a program led by our new Asia Society Seattle Center in collaboration with our team here in Northern California. I'm Margaret Conley, the Executive Director of our centers, and our team is with us here too. We have three expert speakers on climate with us. Shuo Li, who is the new Director of the China Climate Hub at our Asia Society Policy Institute, Jackson Ewing, who is the Director of Energy and Climate Policy at Duke University, and our moderator is Kithmina Hewage, who is the Senior Advisor at the Center for Asian Philanthropy and Society. All of our speaker bios are on our website in full, and for our format today, our moderator Kithmina will lead a discussion with our two speakers. There'll be an opportunity for audience Q&A, so type your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen at any time during the program, and we'll get to as many questions as we can. This event is on the record. We're recording, and the video is going to be posted on our YouTube channel. We have an hour for this discussion until 5 p.m. Pacific. Thank you for our stellar lineup, and thank you all for joining us. This event, again, is Asia's Pathways to Climate Resilience. Let's get going with Kithmina.
Thank you, Margaret, and welcome everyone to the webinar, and a happy Lunar New Year to everyone celebrating as well. We are talking about Asia's pathway to climate resilience, and I'm happy to be joined by two excellent experts, Jackson and Shuo. I wouldn't go so far to call you the Patrick Mahomes and Travis Kelce of climate change, but let's try and get there during the next hour or so. To everyone participating today, please send in your questions through the Q&A section on Zoom, and I'm happy to integrate some of your questions during our discussion, but we will also have a separate audience Q&A section towards the end. Shuo and Jackson, let's get into it. And Asia is unique, but also important, and arguably one of the most important regions in the world when it comes to tackling climate change, when it comes to having one of the highest populations in the world, having to balance the development needs with the climate resilience programs, but also the differences between countries in terms of economic growth, political systems, and so on. Sure, let me come to you first. Can you give us a kind of a brief context setting about why is Asia important, and also why is Asia different when it comes to talking about climate resilience?
Sure, Kithmina, very happy to be with you and Jackson. Look forward to a very interesting hour of conversation. Let me begin by maybe just say three things. Asia is big, Asia is diverse, and Asia also shares some of the common storylines, among just Asian countries, but also common storylines with countries, beyond this region. So let me just jump into each one of those. Of course, when we talk about Asia's climate action, we're talking about a vast geographic area. We're talking about countries all the way from Turkey, in the west, to some of the Pacific Islands, in the east. This region represents approximately half of the global emissions. So this is a major source of global carbon emissions. The region also has some of the most populous countries in the world. If you look at China and India, and many of them also happen to be major emitters. And most importantly, from an international climate protection point of view, a lot of the Asian countries are still fast growing emitters. When countries in the West, industrialized countries like the United States, many European countries are seeing their emissions declining over the last decade or so. But this region is also such a diverse region. It has some of the biggest countries, as we just mentioned, but also really small ones, right? In Southeast Asia, some of the Pacific Island countries. Different countries also share vastly different development stages. We haven't mentioned Japan and South Korea, some of the most developed economies in the world, but at the same time, a lot of countries are still struggling, trying to alleviate poverty. The resource endowment in this region also couldn't be more different. If we look, zoom into some of the Persian Gulf countries, they're very much endowed with oil and gas resources. And you also have a lot of countries that are deprived from natural resources. Let me also mention some of the shared storylines. Again, both among countries in this region, but also between Asian countries and many other countries elsewhere in the world. One thing that I can think of is obviously the tension in this part of the world between economic growth, the pursuit for prosperity, and the need to protect the environment and combating climate change. I think really all the countries across this region struggle with this tension, this dilemma. How does, for example, a country like Indonesia bring people out of poverty, tap into some of the natural resource, mineral resource that it has, but then at the same time, avoid, jeopardizing some of the most pristine, rainforests in the world. Right? Those are tough questions that countries in this region have to answer. The second shared theme, I think, is really the need for energy transition for countries in Asia, and both the challenges and the opportunities associated with energy transition. Again, many countries in this part of the world have very legitimate a desire to increase their energy consumption for basic human development needs. But at the same time, how do you do that in a low carbon way? Right? This is a tough question that countries like China, India, Indonesia, Bangladesh, they all need to answer. But at the same time, the countries in this region are also very well endowed with some of the green energy. When we look at the solar resource and wind resource in Asian countries, many of them are very blessed with those resources. So the question is, how do they tap into those resources and accelerate their move away from coal, oil, and gas? The very last thing that I want to say here is Asian countries are also quite vulnerable to increasing climate impacts. In fact, many countries in this part of the world are very much on the front line of severe climate impacts. We have some of the major rivers in this part of the world, but they tend to carve out significant, magnificent river deltas as those rivers enter into the sea. Those low-lying lands, right, as sea level rises, are particularly vulnerable to climate impacts. And we don't even need to go to some of the Pacific Island countries to talk about the increasing risks of sea level rise. So let me maybe just leave it there, and by saying that climate change is not just a common challenge or shared challenge in this part of the world. It is increasingly also, as a result of climate impact, a shared experience.
Thanks, Shuo. Jackson, when Shuo spoke about three kind of key messages there, but one of the things that stood out was the opportunities, but also the threats. From your perspective, what are some of the kind of the main threats and opportunities that are currently taking place when it comes to Asia and the climate transition process?
Thanks, Kithmina, and thank you to everyone who made this panel session possible. Shuo unsurprisingly nailed it, in my view, in giving that overview of both Asia's unique levels of vulnerabilities, its unique variability among the different geophysical characteristics of the countries, but also the different development levels, as well as the opportunities broadly put. So I will, because he stole all my perspective answers and said them more smartly than I was going to, I will try to perhaps just put a little bit of a finer point on some of the points that he rose. One is that I think both a challenge and an opportunity is to create very bespoke approaches to these energy transitions and these adaptation strategies and packages in the different countries. Let's start with mitigation. We have multiple categories throughout Asia of countries along the energy access and development continuum. And that really correlates closely with the level of fossil assets they have either in place or in development. So you have a collection of emerging economies, Indonesia, Vietnam, the Philippines, certainly China and India, countries with relatively nascent carbon intensive assets like Pakistan or Bangladesh, which have built coal sectors over the last decade and a half. All of those countries are faced with the challenge of potentially retiring some of those fossil assets before they had planned to. And the reason for that retirement would be to help address climate change. And we're already seeing examples of international efforts, most pronounced in Indonesia and Vietnam presently, but being experimented with in other contexts. Also, of members of the G7, members, institutions in the multilateral development bank and international financial institution realm coming in and saying, okay, let's figure out some sort of package that will help you move away from those fossil assets and into a more renewable energy future that also recognizes your development needs and the need to continue to eradicate poverty, increase qualities of life for your citizenry, which of course is the top priority. But that is a very complicated land and fairly unproven landscape. And so I think that a lot hinges on how successful those efforts will be. On the other side of that coin, countries like Myanmar, Timor-Leste, we could go on, have fewer fossil assets in place and a more pronounced set of development needs that have great immediacy. And many of those development needs tie very closely to energy access. And this is both for human day-to-day well-being, but also for future industrialization and transportation and information technology, all of which will require that kind of penetration of energy. And there, we're talking really about building more new clean systems to fill that gap rather than moving away from something that existed in the past. And again, that's quite a different sort of objective, but one that's important not only for moral reasons for those people, but because that's where the potential future emissions will come from countries like those in their development pathway. And then you have countries like China and India that are sort of both, right? We have the highly developed segments of the economy and geographically concentrated and the far lower development levels of the countries and different sorts of approaches needed in those contexts. And that's to say nothing of the Japans, UAEs, Koreas, Singapores, Qatars that have the high per capita income and are arguably in a position closer to a European country or a North American country that has to find ways to really find greater efficiencies and take a leading role, not only in reducing their own emissions, but in helping those neighbors throughout Asia. The other thing I'll say is that I think that we should pay close attention to the climate assets in the region. We're going to experience a fairly radical transformation in the global economy in response to climate change, and already are in many ways. And that is going to shift geoeconomic and geopolitical relationships as at least the calculation changes around oil, gas, coal, plastics, any hydrocarbon, as the equations change around industrial systems, transportation systems, and the like. And as you see supply chains for things like critical minerals become much more relevant and important. And so here in Asia, we have major players in that realm. Nickel development in Indonesia is massively important for energy transformation efforts around the world, including in developed countries that Indonesia will be growing its exports to. Who's investing in that, developing those resources? How indigenous does that remain versus how much are minerals still exported in their raw form? Who captures the value from that? These are also open questions that I think climate is amplifying and driving. And Asia is also the home of climate assets in the form of carbon sinks. namely forests, but not exclusively forests, soil sequestration, marine sequestration. This is pulling the greenhouse gas emissions out of the atmosphere. We have, for many years, been attempting to find useful and effective ways to value that role. And that has been a mixed story, but it's one that's not going anywhere. And so I think that it will be a real kind of also inflective issue, the extent to which, particularly a number of countries that have those real sequestration sink characteristics are able to gain capital from that and use that capital to help transition their economies and improve the lives of their people.
Thanks, Jackson. I wanted to follow up on that a bit because you kind of, both you and Shuo highlighted the differences between countries in terms of the assets they have, the challenges they face, and the economic paths that they've taken and kind of the levels of development. Given so much difference within Asia itself, are we approaching this topic the right way by trying to find an Asian solution instead of trying to kind of look for more, as you said, bespoke solutions based on different categories of development or energy assets, etc.?
You want me to start?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, sure. Well, of course, you captured us correctly, but I think there were several things, at least on my part, unstated and uncovered there that are also germane to a regional conversation on climate response. One is these physical systems don't respect our political boundaries, right? So there's all sorts of transboundary issues that arise from climate change that are very much, proximate and local. So we can see expanding withdrawals of transboundary river systems, including many of the rivers originating in the Tibetan Plateau, combining with changing precipitation patterns and drought conditions downstream. And all of a sudden, we have very critical situations for water access, for agricultural development, et cetera, that's being accelerated by climate effects. And that is a regional problem that needs regional solutions, whether that's through some of the cooperative bodies that are in place now to manage those water resources, or whether it requires some new thinking or some new institutions and some new science that can help to address that. In any case, it's different now in the context of climate. That's just one example. We'll see, I think, coastal vulnerabilities to fish stocks, for example, that also do not respect our political and cultural boundaries. And so as water temperatures are changing, as conveyance capacities of rivers are changing, et cetera, that can reduce fish stocks, which people depend on for protein, livelihoods, et cetera. And this will really have that kind of regional concentrated effect. I guess the final point I would mention is on population movements. Of course, with displacement, we can see people move around the world, but in most instances, migration is internal within a country or to a neighboring country. And I want to be clear here. I'm not talking about these apocalyptic scenarios of, entire hundreds of millions of people on the coastline having to move. I think that sometimes we might be a little too dramatic on those scenarios in a way that dehumanizes the people themselves and looks at them as just population waves. I think at this point we see something that's a bit more complex and incremental, but still extremely challenging, where climate change amplifies existing development problems in vulnerable areas leading to gradual population movements out of those areas, relatively gradual, I should say, but too rapid for their effective absorption into the cities that they're moving into, et cetera. And you can have all sorts of friction, rural to urban population friction. It's in some cases, in some instances, from Bangladesh to India migration, we've seen group identity friction and conflict that's tied at least in part to environmental changes that were happening in the Bay of Bengal region. So that's another issue area where geography really matters, and Asian problems need Asian solutions.
Thank you. Sure, I want to kind of build on that. So speaking of to address transnational issues, politics obviously plays a massive part in this. And I'll move on to more global geopolitical considerations later, but I want to focus first on Asian politics. What types of political leadership is being taken? Can you give some examples of political leadership that has been taken within the Asian region when it comes to this issue? And in terms of government to government initiatives within Asia, are there any examples that have made progress in tackling climate change and moving towards climate resilience?
Sure, Kithmina. I mean, let me just say, like both this, but also your previous questions, I find them kind of excellent questions. Just on your latter question, what kind of leadership from Asia have we seen? I do think there is this emerging trend in some of the Asian countries, this increasing alignment between the climate agenda and the economic agenda, increasing realization that not only do these two issues work not in conflict with each other, but also increasingly they can mutually reinforce each other. You look at countries like India, of course, China has been doing this for a long time, tapping into some of the emerging technologies, business models related to energy development. The leading role, for some countries in this region when it comes to both, investing, but also deploying solar energy, wind, electric vehicles, and so on. I also think that in many countries in this region also increasingly realizes one point, and this kind of goes back to your earlier point, which is, does it actually make sense for us to talk about climate action in the broad Asian context, given the diversity that we talked about? I think the increasing realization among countries in this part of the world is they can probably learn from each other a bit more, and lessons from their neighboring countries might be a bit more relevant than some of the lessons that elsewhere in the world, in particular industrialized countries, can offer them. And in this context, if you kind of just zoom into some of the Asian countries' relationship with the West, we are, for example, talking about increasingly trilateral cooperation. For example, with the involvement with some of the traditional donor countries in the West, right? They may have certain resource expertise that needs to help, and some of the Southeast Asian countries, in particular, who may have the increasing need for energy. And here, adding on top of that, the third party, which could be China, Japan, or Korea, right? Which is somewhere in the middle in terms of development stage, but also their experience when it comes to scaling up their energy sector. So again, the point here is there is probably a lot of synergy for countries within this region compared to countries beyond this part of the world.
Right, and let me now move on to kind of more global measures, because I think that caters to what you just said, particularly on kind of gatherings like COP28 most recently. There was a lot of kind of give and take about what the developing economies needed and what was kind of what the objectives of COP28 and the COPs in general were. What do you think the biggest developments from COP28 were for the Asian region? Sure.
Sure. Again, I think two themes, which we have already mentioned quite a bit. Energy transition, that's number one. Number two, how do we react to the increasing severe impacts of climate change? These two issues have been very much highlighted in the most recent COP28 in the UAE, December last year. And when we look at energy transition, COP28 delivered a pretty strong signal, right? A pretty strong political desire to transition away from fossil fuels. In many ways, a lot of people say this is, a groundbreaking move, but a move 20 years or 30 years too late. Because indeed, if you want to tackle climate change seriously, you need to face the imperative of moving away from fossil fuels. Still, I wouldn't underestimate the symbolic value of reaching this decision. I think both Jackson, you were at a COP, I was also at a COP. This really took a lot of diplomatic effort. And of course, Asian countries, given their increasing energy demand, I should also mention that the COP is, of course, hosted in one of the Asia Pacific region countries. A lot of Asian countries really have high stakes in this conversation. And you also see their reservation being registered very clearly in the final decision. So despite of this forward-looking positive signal to move away from fossil fuel, the COP also failed, partly because of the reservation from many countries in this part of the world. For example, moving further, the decision on coal, right? Shying away from the need to accelerate the phase out or the phase down of coal. But also, we need to recognize on the adaptation and loss and damage front, the COP also delivered a quite important outcome, which is to operationalize this so-called loss and damage fund with some early injection of financial resource. And just to explain here, when we talk about climate change, people normally talk about the two sides of the same coin, which is mitigation. How do you reduce emissions? If we're not doing that enough, the other side of the coin, how do you then adapt to the adverse impact of climate change? But increasingly, there's a third pillar, which is even if we would, need to adopt, we will probably not do that fast enough, so that there will be inevitably losses and damages as a result of climate impacts. So how do we deal with that? In particular, how do we help vulnerable countries to deal with that? So that's a major outcome from the recent COP. We now have a financial mechanism with some initial resources to help some of the most vulnerables to tackle the adverse impact of climate change. And many of the countries, I should highlight, many of the vulnerable countries are also in Asia.
But do you think that those financial commitments are adequate or realistic? There has a lot of the criticism from Asian governments, developing countries in particular, has been to say the West kind of promises this money, but the money never comes. What do you think of that?
Sure. No, I think that's a very legitimate concern. This has, in fact, been one of the consistent themes of international climate negotiations, the grievance that many of the global South countries have vis-a-vis, many Western countries who have already been industrialized. So again, I just want to say that the progress that we made when it comes to loss and damage finance are really still only baby steps. And in fact, right, when we have to tackle loss and damage, that is already telling you a lot about the lack of progress when it comes to reducing emissions in the first place. But let me also add one more point here, which is I do think there is also a need in the medium to long term when you look at international climate politics to move beyond the traditional north-south divide. The common dynamic of show us the money before we show you the climate action. Again, this is still just a reflection of countries not fully convinced when it comes to the imperative to take action, and also the point that taking action at the end of the day is in the interest of all the countries, right? So I do think it is important to kind of go beyond this traditional dichotomy. And here also, I just want to highlight many Asian countries have a very unique role in helping us to transform the politics.
Jackson, when it comes to transnational politics, I think the US-China relationship is arguably the most important, given that they're the two biggest polluters, two of the biggest polluters, and also in terms of the resources that they can kind of combine to help each other, but also other countries as well. We've seen climate change be sort of the dove in the middle of some strained relations. We saw this with the Paris Agreement. We saw this at APEC. In most recent times, given the US-China relationship and the most strained relationships that they've had, where do you see climate within this dynamic, and how do you see it playing out in the future?
I'm going to start answering that question by picking up where Shuo left off on the shifting dichotomy between the global north, the global south, the east and west as well. I think if we look backwards to the first 2 decades from the early 1990s into the early 2010s of international climate diplomacy, the US and China were consistent loggerheads, and the barriers were fairly entrenched. The US would say, well, we could do all these things on climate, but if we do that and China isn't held to similar standards, we're going to put ourselves at a competitive disadvantage. And we're actually not going to solve the climate problem because their emissions are growing much more rapidly. They have a large population. They're industrializing. So it won't really work naturally, scientifically, and it's going to be a problem for us. I mean, this comes into real contrast with some other countries, like many of those in Europe, that said, we'll be first movers. And we will help the developing countries come alongside behind us. But that was a political reality in the United States, that often there was bipartisan support for not entering into any sorts of hard commitments if China were not also included, and would call out China by name there. And so that really slowed down progress during those 2 decades, in my view. And China, for its part, was open to playing a global great power when it suited itself to do so in international diplomatic forums, and a developing country that had to focus in on poverty eradication and development needs at the expense of prioritizing climate or more rapidly transitioning its energy systems. And that comes also from an understandable place. I mean, that is a reality. China is both of those things and was both of those things. But from a climate negotiation perspective, this just led to a lot of kind of recriminations and passing the ball back and forth, and I think really hamstrung a lot of what could and ultimately could not get done during that period. And that, in my view, is one of the real reasons that entire system that was crafted during those first 2 decades began to fall down. And by that system, I mean these very different codified targets between developed and developing countries, Annex 1 and non-Annex 1 in climate speak. And when that began to erode, and I think the beginning of the end was really in 2009 in Copenhagen, it started to suit both the US and Chinese interests, because we moved into a system of countries building up their bottom-up plans. that suited their own national circumstances, and that's something, and would be less constrained by the international system and the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change or elsewhere. That jibed with both what China and the US wanted to see. And I think that made possible the series of bilateral climate agreements in 2014, 15, and 16 between Presidents Xi and then President Obama, which were very instrumental in creating the Paris Agreement, which then in turn is still what guides us to this day. So I think that the only reason I go back so far is because I think that that reveals how important this relationship actually is. I was fortunate to be in Beijing just after the Sunnylands dialogue, and was able to have a briefing with Xi Jinping, China's special envoy, before the release of the agreement. And it was, while not getting into the particulars, I think the tone of that outcome was extremely positive. And we shouldn't underestimate that even as the larger politics are complicated by issues such as then President Trump pledging to withdraw the U.S. from the Paris Agreement, or Speaker Pelosi's visit to Taiwan derailing further U.S.-China climate cooperation for a time, that many of the people on both sides of the Pacific have known each other for decades, and have been working together on this issue for those decades. And that really starts with Special Envoy Xi Jinping and Special Envoy, or retiring outgoing Special Envoy John Kerry in the United States. But it goes down to staff levels as well. And there's a lot more leadership, and there's a lot more kind of connective tissue that's there than many of us recognize from the outside looking in. So that's one of the things that gives me confidence moving forward, that this will be an issue of some priority in the relationship. On the idea that climate is this bright spot in an otherwise contentious relationship, I think that's certainly true in many cases and at many times. But I also find that to not be as comforting, because that shows that climate, one, can be viewed and addressed in something of a non-contentious way, hypothetically. And I think that, like Shuo said earlier, climate is intersecting with the main economic and even geopolitical issues of the day. And so when we talk about things like trade disputes and intellectual property and technology transfer, the US efforts now to put domestic content requirements on its clean energy infrastructure explicitly to kind of segment out China and diversify its supply chains away from China, I think we're entering into a period where climate is not going to be as isolated or isolatable, I'm pretty sure that's not a word, from these sorts of hard diplomacy, hard trade, hard economic issues as it's been seen to be in the past, or that it has been in the past. So that's difficult. And also, we're still vulnerable to spoilers. I think that the Pelosi visit to Taiwan demonstrated that most recently, but spoilers can come in other forms and at other times. So cautiously optimistic, but also concerned about some of the ways that it could not go as deep as it needs to, and ways in which it could be derailed.
And I'm guessing the biggest spoiler could be November.
Sure. I think the U.S. in some ways, in the eyes of China and others, suffers a credibility problem at times when we vacillate in our federal climate policy. And the movement from the Obama era climate policies into the Trump era climate policies into the Biden era climate policies is a good exemplifier of that. That's, high levels of change. And when we're thinking about a long-term problem and a complicated diplomatic environment that defines climate, this is something that leads to a view of a lack of dependability, and suspicion about commitments that are made, on terms of whether they're going to be durable or not, and whether they're going to be followed through upon. The one thing I would mention there, and I think this is particularly important for an audience from Northern California and the Pacific Northwest, is that subnational activity on climate in the US is extremely important. And I think that it's a fairly easy argument to make that subnational cooperation between parts of the US and China, and subnational action on climate more broadly, were scaled up in response to an effort to move our federal policy in the other direction. Shortly after then President Trump's Rose Garden speech withdrawing or declaring the intention to withdraw from the Paris Agreement, we saw California Governor Jerry Brown on a stage with Xi Jinping in Beijing, and a matter of weeks later, essentially saying California is still here to cooperate. And there's real tangible and specific MOUs, treaties, areas of cooperation that have been established between states, provinces, cities to cities, universities to universities, et cetera, that are quite important for keeping that relationship warm, but also for making scientific progress and making material progress. And so Washington's not the only game in town.
Sure, you were in Beijing up until 4 weeks ago, and so you kind of have a first-hand experience of what these discussions have been like in Beijing as well. How are they responding to these subnational responses that are happening in the US?
Sure, Kithmina. I agree with Jackson. I do think just in light of the US. The subnational cooperation between the U.S. and China is a very important component when it comes to climate engagement between the two countries. And we all recognize that climate engagement is not a sufficient condition for global climate progress. It is certainly a necessary one, right? So in that regard, I do think it is a very important area. If states here in the U.S., California, on the West Coast, Washington State, for example, can continue to deepen their dialogues and cooperation. I also think there are, as Jackson has already mentioned, real areas of synergies. How do you, for example, leverage some of the technologies, R&D that are happening here in the U.S., in particular on the West Coast? How do you kind of accelerate their deployment in not only China but also elsewhere in Asia? But at the same time, I think if you are plugged into policy level conversations there in Beijing, you will find it hardly surprising that people do pay attention to the politics in Washington. Not only the U.S.-China dynamic, but also, the election politics. And this is indeed one of the most difficult challenges when it comes to global climate action, which is one of the largest economies in the world, carrying so much political volatilities when it comes to its own climate action, and also just the gravity that the U.S. carries, the fact that many countries, including China, including, I would say, almost all the Asian countries, they do pay attention to U.S.'s action or lack of action. The U.S. climate decisions really loom very large in their domestic climate conversation. So in a way, I would say there is no meaningful global climate solution if the tough, climate political questions here in the U.S. are not meaningfully addressed. I would say the same. There won't be any meaningful global climate solution if the two biggest emitters in the world, the U.S. and China, cannot find a way to engage with each other.
Thank you. And before I move on to the audience Q&A, I would like to ask everyone to send in their questions, and we have a few more minutes between us, and then we'll kind of move on to the audience Q&A. Jackson, I wanted to kind of follow up on what Shuo said in terms of this leadership, but also at the subnational level, you kind of brought that up. I'm curious to know, are there any subnational responses in Asia? So I think it's easy to kind of think of subnational responses in the US, but are there similar responses within Asia as well?
Well, sure. I think we could stay on China to start with. There, we do China. We do a disservice to the complexity of our understanding of the Chinese system by thinking of it as extremely top down in the execution of its central economic planning and climate policy. So much of that is happening at provincial and county municipal levels. And so, I think we see both instances of innovation in terms of finding cities that are more efficient, that use really innovative approaches to energy production, but also to green spaces and sequestration, et cetera, that are piloted, tested, and then can spread subnationally in China, and also kind of more negative instances of climate dynamics in which you'll see provincial governments perpetuate the production and use of coal for non-economic and non-environmental reasons, namely to kind of prop up existing industries and keep economic growth numbers high. So in all of these large, complicated countries, I think that there's an enormous presence already, not just future role, but presence already of subnational activity, and that's amplified at times in countries as some degree of political decentralization happens. And countries like Indonesia have been going through decentralization now for well over a decade, probably closer to two, and that is enormously important when you consider that addressing climate is largely about how you're managing your natural resource endowment, and how you are, to get maybe a bit philosophical about it, managing your relationship with nature and natural systems, and squaring that with what you need in terms of air conditioning and cars and motorbikes and televisions and telephones, et cetera. So if you are having an increasingly varied approach to how those things are managed through a system of political decentralization, subnational action becomes much more important. The issue here, though, is that that doesn't get captured in many ways diplomatically in the international system at this point. That's true. I think it's unassailably true, and it's really true all around the world. But our diplomatic system is based on nation to nation, state to state relations. And there's arguably not a great substitute for that, given how complicated it already is, without disaggregating further. So there is something of a tension, I think, between where a lot of implementation action happens and where it's most important, i.e. subnationally, and where much of the discussion takes place nationally.
I agree, and if I may plug some of our own work at CAPS, we recently published a report called Build Back Greener, which looks at private sector initiatives in Asia on climate resilience. And what we found is that there's a lot of action happening at the subnational level that is focused on localities of where the companies are working or have relationships with. And I think that's where a lot of the innovation and the investment is happening. Let me go to some audience questions. Shuo, I think I'll combine two questions here. Kind of, what can we do to accelerate the transition to clean energy in developing countries? But at the same time, if you can also bring in some examples where it has succeeded or failed in doing so.
Sure, Kithmina, good questions. Well, in terms of scaling up and accelerating the deployment of renewable, what I would say is, if you look at this question from the Chinese point of view, there has been a very vibrant ongoing discussion on what role can China play, right, to help other countries in this region to embrace, for example, solar, wind, and other clean technology, given, of course, China's dominating role in manufacturing. some of the clean energy products, right? And also China's track record for infrastructure development, supporting infrastructure development. For example, along the Belt and Road, a large part of it covers Asia. I just on that discussion, one thing that I find interesting is deploying clean energy is much more than just an infrastructure, a construction exercise. In fact, the infrastructure aspect of it is actually not the most difficult. I mean, we already have, just in terms of cost, we already have some of the cheapest clean energy solutions in the world. Wind and solar, in many cases, if you just look at those equipments, they're cheaper than the coal-fired power plant or gas-fired power plant. The problem is always, do we have the necessary policy frameworks, right, to invite investors, to give them the secured investment return rate? Do we also have some of the the grid system to enable those energy infrastructure? So this is kind of the complexity when it comes to deploying clean energy. It doesn't just look like adding Lego pieces in a Southeast Asian country. There's a whole set of actions that will need to be taken associated with the infrastructure piece. So the question is, how can we get the policy, the soft infrastructure also in place? I think that's probably one way to enable stronger clean energy development in Asia. And then just on the resilience question, the lesson learned, also failure, I just want to kind of point out, again, this will give the audience an idea on the complexity of issues like adaptation, loss, and damage. When we talk about those issues, a lot of times the first thing that comes into mind is infrastructure. Let's build a dam so that we can somehow curtail the impact of sea level rise. But it is there's more than it, right? Than just infrastructure. When we talk about reacting climate impacts, one thing that countries are already doing, they need to do more, is establishing early warning system based on, for example, better, more timely, better focused. Countries can then see if there are climate change related severe weather events coming their way. And if they can do that, they can then put in necessary measures, be them, unfortunately, evacuation, taking people to shelter or other measures. Right? That's just a way, a very important way to save lives and reduce the losses and damages.
Jackson, I want to go to the next audience question, which is on intra-Asian cooperation. And could intra-Asian cooperation be more efficient and impactful compared to Western cooperation with Asia? And in what ways can this cooperation take place?
I'll go back and hopefully not repeat myself too much to my previous comment about areas where geographic proximity really matters. But here, let's talk about it in terms of energy specifically, rather than in terms of vulnerability and threat. We already see instances of productive energy cooperation in Asia. Say what you will about Laos' export of electricity to Thailand from the hydro sector. That has a number of difficulties, both socioeconomically and in terms of the ecosystem health of the river systems in the Mekong Basin. Those are all true. But it also reflects a country using its innate capacity to produce electricity as part of its economic development plan, and in this case, exporting that electricity to a demand center that's not within its own country, that in fact is across a boundary, in this case in Thailand. And so there are lots of instances where that kind of energy relationship is possible because of renewable energy capabilities and the capacity for agents in Asia to tap into those possibilities of, solar in northern Australia feeding an Indonesian market, et cetera, where there's demand. And so matching up those supply characteristics with where power is needed is, I think, really a place of extreme opportunity for the region. And that's unique to an intra-Asian context that can't be replicated by cooperation outside the region, unless we're talking about on its margins. But like Shuo says, I mean, the policy frameworks here are essential, one, and we don't have time for me to elaborate on that, but that's where the solutions have to be found rather than on a technical level where they're largely found. And I also just want to follow up on what he mentioned about profitability and the role of the private sector, and say we have to really disaggregate that. If you want to be in the business of renewable energy production and building solar installations or wind installations and producing power and selling that power to a place that will ultimately get to a customer, then that's a profitable enterprise. And the private sector has shown around the world, including throughout Asia, that it is willing to be in that business. If you want to talk about grid modernization, if you want to talk about risk reduction, political or economic risk reduction, or broader kind of adjacent infrastructure development that's needed to have the supply chains to build those systems, if you're going to talk even further down the track about contractual sanctity, corruption, all of those things that make up an attractive investment environment or prevent a place from being an attractive investment environment, those are not areas that the private sector is going to fix. And that's not just the developers, that's the private banks as well. That's the asset managers. They're not going to fix that. So those sorts of challenges are where we need development finance, both domestically and internationally.
Sure, I've been given the 2-minute warning. I know you have something very quick to say. So you have any final thoughts?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. I just feel like, a lot of the questions really go back to one of the earliest question that you raised, Kithmina, which is, does it make sense to talk about climate change in the broad Asian context? And a lot of the conversation today was about, how Asia has been defined by climate change, right? They're been defined by climate change in the sense that, some of the countries here are the largest, emitters. But I think it is also probably interesting or important to turn this narrative around, which is how Asia, this part of the world, can redefine climate action. And this is an interesting issue for me because if you look at the global climate discourse, the issue has largely so far been defined by developed and industrialized countries. They have the privilege and the luxury in developed countries to actually think about the environmental consequences of some of the development. And now, of course, with the increasing climate urgency, the real issue is, can some of the other countries, well developing themselves, given enough attention and to decarbonize at the same time. So I do think, from this point of view, there is a need for Asian countries to redefine climate action in a slightly different way compared to their industrialized counterparts.
Absolutely. And on that call to action, that more voices and more platforms need to be given to Asians and Asia to kind of redefine its role in climate resilience and climate action. Thank you very much, Shuo. Thank you very much, Jackson, for your insights. And I'll hand it back to Margaret. Thank you, everyone, for participating and your questions.
Yes, lovely way to end there. Thank you so much, Shuo, Jackson, and Kithmina. We're glad to hear that there's more alignment with climate and economic policy, and we appreciate you all sharing with us what to watch for in the year ahead, and especially this election year. For our audience, if you are not already an Asia Society member in Seattle or Northern California, please join us. You're going to get access to terrific events. We have a number of programs coming up in Seattle, San Francisco, Silicon Valley, and virtually. A film screening tonight in San Francisco of the Oscar-nominated short, Nai Nai and Waipaw. AI regulation in Silicon Valley and Asia. That's February 20th at Google. An executive roundtable on disinformation in ASEAN countries on February 27th in Seattle with virtual access to Northern California members. The latest on Taiwan on March 15th in Seattle with virtual access for Northern California. And our big Game Changer West Gala on April 4th in San Francisco, spotlighting remarkable Asians and Asian Americans changing the world. Join us at our events. Thank you to our Asia Society team, to Man Wong, who curated this program, Christy, Nina, Jason, Aaron, and all of our interns. We're deeply grateful again to all of our speakers. And Kithmina, being based in San Francisco, we're going to forgive your Chiefs reference from earlier. On behalf of Asia Society Seattle and Northern California, thank you all for joining us.